solution architect and Azure product manager. He's been in the field for over 22 years. Does a whole host of IT undertakings, including design and install solutions for our customers. Majority of experience is in server software, hardware technology such as VMware, vSphere, and Microsoft products such as Server, or Exchange Server, Windows Server, Active Directory, remote desktop services, and virtual desktops. So there's more in the bio, I think, if you have some of our little placeholder cards. Also like to introduce Mr. Ryan Lee, IT Director at Wylie, married father of 2, caretaker of bearded dragons and a guinea pig, huh?
Yeah.
Lizard King.
Starting a little amphibian army, so me and Mike have the CORP market cornered on that one.
I know Ryan well. He also used to work at Network Center, over 14 years in the industry. I'll let you guys give a little bit of introductions on yourself if you'd like, but I'll pass it on. Thanks, guys.
Awesome. Thank you, Brady.
So, thanks for coming. Welcome to Envision. Glad everybody's here. And I have the session right after lunch, so if you're in that session, it's a safe place to take a nap. If you get food comas like I usually do at conferences. So today, we're going to do a talk about, a less technical talk about Azure and more about how to get into Azure. Like Brady said, I'm Mike Pagán. I'm a senior solution architect. I've been with Network Center for 22 years. I've been described as an outdoor enthusiast with a technology addiction. He's said that when I needed some help with my bio. But
I said a lot meaner things, too.
I'm married. I have 3 kids. I have 2 cats and a tortoise, which is basically what happens if you let your kid go to a Merit Badge University and Boy Scouts, and 2 weeks later you come back with a credit card bill and a tortoise named Gordon. So I'll let you take over for your introduction.
Yeah. So Ryan Lee, like Brady said, been in IT for a couple of years. I manage an IT department at Wylie now, so it's a trucking company up in North Fargo. Let's see, a little bit about me. Married, happily married still. My wife told me to say that. I also have 3 kids and try to get some exotic pets because I just want to be like Mike in everything I do. I got a bearded dragon named Charizard. He used to be Charmander, but he's evolved, so now he's at his final stage. And a guinea pig named Milky Way, guinea pigs are mean. That's what I'll say about the guinea pig. But anyway, my daughter seems to like her, so we let it slide. But other than that, yeah, have a lot of very similar hobbies to Mike. And if you know Mike, you probably know me too. We got matching beards for the event too.
So when we were planning for Envision, we try to have a planning session every year. I usually do a technical session. I'm doing another technical session on Azure this afternoon, Azure Services. But I thought it might be interesting to talk about what goes into Azure, because we always leap to infrastructure as a service, and then end state, you already have it. But what does it look like to make the decision to get into Azure? Like, what does that look like? You can always talk to someone like Network Center or Microsoft or anyone about it. But if you wanted to do some investigation, if you wanted to take a look at some of that kind of stuff on your own, what does that look like? So that's the purpose of what the presentation is. So why do we want to consider moving to Azure? And we all have virtual machines or servers on-prem. Why do we want to move them somewhere else? What does it cost? We'll go through an example of kind of what that looks like, how to price that out, and then what goes into designing it. You know, it's easy to say that I'll just take what I have and I'll move it up there. And you can do that, but that isn't how you're going to save the most money. And we touch on that a little bit, but mostly we're just going to talk about those key points. So
I think one of the big things to remember is moving to Azure is not always about saving money. It's more about keeping your business nimble and allowing for growth or reduction, depending on how the market does. If, you know, say a large pandemic comes through and wreaks havoc on your industry, that's places where you'll really see a lot of benefit, is just in that flexibility.
Yep. So, you know, as Ryan was just talking about, what are the benefits of moving your virtual machines into Azure? Most of it is pay-as-you-go pricing. So the more you have, the more you pay. If you know your environment's going to grow and shrink dynamically, if you're in accounting for tax season, you're in an egg business, and you need more compute or more resources during planting and harvest, that's a good way, a good methodology for it. And if you also know that you're going to move to Azure, then you can commit for a 1 or 3 year term, extending a subscription, for example, similar example, and then you can save money by doing that. So it's not all pay as you go. So there's other options there. Dynamic workloads, like we're talking, you happen to be a retail type of business, then yeah, there we go. If you're in a retail organization, busy season's coming up. If you needed bigger servers, more compute than you had normally, more than you'd want to buy and not use for most of the year, you turn your virtual machine off, you make it bigger, you pay for that as long as it's bigger, and then when the season's over, you can shrink it down and save money. Another major benefit, I think, is a majority of the innovation for technology now is coming in as a service type of product. So if you look at Microsoft 365 and all the innovation that's coming in that platform, Exchange on-prem is going to get some of those services, but it's getting those on a slower cycle. And when you get it, you need to install it and configure it yourself or have somebody help you do it. When it's on a platform, Azure 365, other ones like that, it becomes a new configuration page. There's different options up there. Sometimes that's good if you want those features, if you have those types of, if you want those types of services. Sometimes it's bad because sometimes if you haven't logged into the Azure portal in a couple months, you log in, the config page is completely different than it used to be. There's more options or less options, or it just looks differently. So it's a double-edged sword, but the faster innovation definitely comes on platforms. And additionally, as we were mentioning, there's no supply chain issues. So right now, if you wanted to buy a 10 gig switch, you might be able to get it in 2 weeks. You might be able to get it in 9 months. So if that's a part of which you need to grow your infrastructure or storage or any of the rest of those things, we're starting to come out of it. But for a while there, it was really hard to get technology. So if you were up against a end of support timeline, or if you needed to grow, add a bunch of resources to your environment, you might have been stuck for a while. Platforms like Azure don't have those types of constraints typically. So.
And I think another thing to note as far as budget planning goes, so if anyone's had to put together an IT budget before, the pain of trying to plan out what's coming up for the next year, 2 years, and how you're going to grow. With Azure, you take that out of the mix, right? So you can plan out for the next month, 2 months, and just estimate your high cost spend year-end total, which varies wildly from trying to plan out all the intricacies of on-prem infrastructure.
So how much does Azure cost? It varies, depends on every environment. But when we're looking at, if you're going to look at your own environment, what do you need to kind of consider? I like to use a tool called RV Tools. It's a little utility that you can download, run against your VMware environment, and it creates a giant spreadsheet with tons of tabs, but it collects all the information from your VMware environment, your virtual machines, each virtual machine, how many virtual CPUs, how many cores per host, how much memory, how much disk, your licensing. It's a great documentation tool, but it grabs all the information that I need to basically start a quote. And the other major component is the Azure Calculator. The calculator is available on Microsoft's website. Anybody can go to it. It's a partner tool. You can go out there, and if you're bored, you can configure the most expensive Azure server you can get and figure out how many dollars per second it costs to run that type of thing, which is kind of fun. You can design your own AL, ML, data lake, so and what's. Like I don't even know what half those things are. But all those services are there. If you wanted to kind of run through that and kind of create an estimate and change your options and tinker around with it, you can kind of see how it's you can customize your spend based on what your needs are. And then there's some other tools out there. Some of these tools listed here are more analytical. They'll sit and run in your environment for 15 days, 30 days. They'll collect information. They'll make recommendations on your environment about sizing your environment, what type of virtual machines to use, because it's alphabet soup about the virtual machine sizes. So there's other utilities also. Just plain Jane, I'd like to use RV tools and put it in the calculator, and we'll see what that looks like here in a little bit.
And one thing that you want to note with any of this is these systems look confusing and it looks like there's a lot of data there, but the main important part is knowing what your business is, what your current infrastructure looks like, and how those different workloads or different applications that you're using are going to exist in a more virtual environment in the cloud. So you need to be not so much an expert in Azure as you should be an expert in your business.
So after I have an RV tools collection, I take a look at the virtual machines and kind of parse out how many virtual CPUs, how much RAM's on the system, the number of disks, the size, and kind of the performance characteristics of it. Because in Azure, you can do a standard hard disk to a premium SSD. Now they have an Ultra SSD. So if you need high performance on it, you're selecting those options when you go through it and choose it. When you're thinking about connecting on site, because we all have users still, and they'll have to come to work, those types of things. You need to kind of take into consideration how many sites you have, because that determines how many site-to-site VPNs you have, or how they're going to connect to their resources. If you're going to do any client VPNs, that's just kind of a part of the calculation when you create your VPN gateways. And then consider, if you can, what the server's purpose is. What is it going to be used for? Is it your file server that needs to be up 24/7, or is it a kind of an archive server that's going to be sitting and you only kind of need it 8 to 5, or you only need it a couple days of the month? Because if it's a couple days of the month thing, you can categorize it more as a pay-as-you-go. You can set up automation, or you can just manually turn it on when you need it, use it, and then turn it off, and have a lot less spend than you have if it's on 24/7. And those characteristics determine how you can set up your payment, basically, if you're going to do pay-as-you-go, or if you can commit to it for like 1 or 3 years and get a discount. And then sizing. You don't want to pay for more than you need. I've seen 16 virtual CPU and 16 gig domain controllers, which worked on-prem, but it's going to be really expensive in Azure. So look at your workloads and figure out what makes sense. On-prem, you're likely, I have the resources, I'm just going to do it. In Azure, you probably want to be a little more granular about how you set that up.
I think one of the biggest things to remember is, again, back to budgeting. If you've ever tried to be cost efficient in your department, is think of it like a buffet versus an a la carte, right? So in your traditional on-prem environment, you have a amount allocated. You want to use it all up and get your money's worth out of that device that you're using. In Azure, it's not an apples to apples comparison when you convert. You're looking for a la carte. You get just enough, just the things you need, see what you can consolidate, and it's a very different shift as you have to understand what those application workloads look like and where they can reside.
So the big question is Azure going to save you money? Same as virtual desktops, my immediate answer after doing this for a while is probably not going to save you money. It's depending on how you're going to do the comparison. In many cases, when people are reviewing a infrastructure upgrade, it's like, I have this hardware quote, let me see what Azure costs in comparison to that hardware quote. So it's this versus a monthly spend. And it's very different. They're very different technologies. They're different cost models. So in my opinion, you have to characterize it differently. You have to look longer out to a point, and then you also have to consider all the benefits you get from Azure and make those calculations. The more you know about your business, the more you know what your planning is, definitely helps. So if you know that you have a imaging software, a CRM software or something in-house that you're going to move away from and move to a SaaS platform, and that happens to have 2 SQL servers and 2 application servers and so on and so forth, you may have to size your hardware for that, but you can size Azure for that, but knowing that in a year you can probably turn that off or reduce the costs. So that kind of balances the scales. And we have an example that where I basically made this comparison for a customer. So it's live information. pulled from an RV Tools that we're going to go through here in a second. So this is our example. Basically, the customer has 2 VMware hosts, shared storage, Windows 2012, R2 virtual machines, Linux virtual machine appliances, about 60 users, 5 offices. All of the hardware is going end of life, or it's end of support. You can't renew support. And Windows 2012 is going end of life in October next year. Start planning now, please, if you're going to make any changes. So
if you think you have enough time to migrate, you don't get started. Yeah. There's always something that comes up.
So the screenshots here are basically snaps of RV Tools. So you can see the virtual machines that are listed there. It's probably a little hard to see, but size, the virtual memory allocated to the virtual machines, the virtual CPUs, and then I did some math to kind of put some things together there. Here is essentially a really rough, simple diagram of what an Azure environment looks like when you're doing infrastructure as a service. You have your on-prem resources. There's a site-to-site VPN that you create your VPN tunnels to, and then there's virtual machine resources behind it in a subnet. Basically the same as you do now if you're going to take your existing equipment and move it to a data center that was at one of your offices. So it's really not much different than that at the end of the day. Azure environments typically always include a VPN gateway for that VPN tunnel. We have our virtual machines, it's a virtual network, and then Azure backups. So shortly here, we'll be doing a quick demo. We're going to set those things up in the Azure calculator so you can kind of see what that looks like, the options there. And then on the right-hand side are all the virtual machines that are part of the scenario. The top 2 are Exchange. I'm not going to consider those for moving for Azure. Microsoft doesn't support running Exchange in guest in Azure. They want you to use 365. So we don't want to move that. The bottom ones are VMware Server, a VMware component, and Veeam. So obviously we're not going to move VMware into Azure. It's possible to do that if you're really interested. And we're going to replace Veeam with Azure Backup. So
one thing you're going to see here, and we're going to cover again and again, is that when you're looking for efficiencies, moving to SaaS, anything, whenever possible, really helps out, especially as IT teams are reluctant to, or companies are reluctant to add headcount to your IT teams. They want you to keep doing more with less, or at the minimum, at least the same headcount. Moving those SaaS apps keeps the support costs way down. You don't have to spend as much time patching, updating, fixing security vulnerabilities, things like that. Microsoft or whoever your SaaS provider is takes care of that and solves a lot of those problems for you. So when you see those opportunities, if it's SQL Exchange, whatever, move those ones when you can, and you'll save yourself a lot of headache down the road.
So now let's take a look at what Azure Calculator looks like to configure a couple different resources here. So here is the URL. Anybody can go to it. It's azure.microsoft.com/calc. And I've signed in to an account. You can go through, create some configurations and save them. You can go back and look at them later. You can copy them. You can share them with somebody. So it's for a Microsoft tool, it's actually pretty useful. So we're going to pick a virtual machine. We're going to do a VPN gateway.
And one thing you can see here while Mike's picking this is that search utility is super handy. There's a ton of features, a ton of different things that you can pick and buy in Azure. If you have a rough idea of what you're looking for, use that search functionality. Saves you a ton of time versus the hunt and peck through all of the different options that exist there.
So we have the resources. It's added them to the list here. I've done a quick name on it. So now we're to the point of configuring the virtual machine. First up is the region. I think there's at least 53 regions across the world. You want to choose one that's closest to where your users are to have the least amount of latency. For us, it's typically the north central region, which is somewhere in Ohio. But it might be the central region, or it might be, if most of your users are in Colorado, it's going to be West US or West US 2. There are ways to figure out that, but generally you want, same as anything, you want your data as close to your users as possible to reduce latency. So we'll choose North Central US, and you can it builds this cost estimate as we go. So the next option is operating system. So in our scenario, we have Windows and we have some Linux operating systems, virtual machines. Two options, but notice if I change the operating system in Linux, the cost changes because you don't pay for Linux. Linux is typically free. There's Red Hat enterprise agreements. You can pay for Linux and get support if you want, but in general, a lot of Linux distributions run for free. So that changed the cost to $73 instead of $140 because you're paying per second that virtual machine is running. So you can see that there's benefits if you turn it off. There's no cost for the compute or the Windows licensing. We'll switch to category. So if you look at instances, these are all the different types of instances, virtual machine sizes. One thing that I had to get used to when I started working on Azure is the fact that I can't run it like VMware. I can't choose 2 virtual CPUs and 6 gigs of RAM, or 1 virtual CPU and 16 gigs of RAM, unless there's a size specifically for it. It is less customizable. It's not like a buffet where you get to pick whatever you want. It's more about going through the drive-through and picking a number 2 or a number 7 or a Happy Meal. There's set sizes. So if you have any odd use cases of 3 virtual CPUs and 7 gigs of RAM, you're going to have to pick something that basically matches. But all those letters mean something. There are a couple different categories, which I like that they added this because it helps you narrow it down. There's compute optimized, which is prefers cores over memory in a system. So you might be able to have 8 virtual CPUs versus 4 gigs of RAM if you had a system that needed something like that. There's memory optimized, which you may have 1 virtual CPU and 32 gigs of RAM. So those are those 2 options in there. There's general purpose virtual machines, which are your file servers, your domain controllers, basic things like that. Memory optimized for me are RDS servers, SQL servers, because you usually have 2 virtual CPUs and 32 gigs of RAM or 64 gigs of RAM, things like that. They're storage optimized if you really need to focus on throughput of your disks. I haven't ever quoted a high performance compute, but there's use cases for that. And there's virtual machines that have GPUs. So that is a really interesting case when you're looking at doing virtual desktops, or if you had any, actually GPUs work well for cracking passwords if you're in the security business, or AL or MI, like those types of workloads can use those GPUs, or you can use them in virtual desktops. So, but we're gonna do a general purpose virtual machine. So that reduces the virtual machines some, but there's still a ton there. So then now we have series. There's a bunch of ones in here. A's are basically being retired. The B series are burstable. It kind of works on a credit system. So if somebody gives you a gift card, it has $20 on it. You use the $20, and after it's all done for the month, or it's all out. If your compute is over a certain line, you get throttled. So it's good for certain things, maybe domain controllers or file server that isn't being used very much. Typically, all the D's here, there's a version, V5 is going to be the newest infrastructure. It's the newest hardware bus, all those things. So I typically stay with the newest, the highest number V, and then I always make sure it includes an S, because that means that machine type can use a premium SSD where the other ones can't. And you can change these disk sizes anytime you want. You shut off the virtual machine, you can change the VM type to anything. But if you wanted to use a premium disk on a virtual machine size that didn't have an S in it, you'd also have to change the size. So there's no extra cost to it, so I just make sure I always choose the disk. And I always set up my servers, estimate my servers with premium disk anyway. I know. Last thing I want is to move somebody to Azure and have it perform poorly out of the gate. Same as RDS servers, same as virtual desktop. You start losing immediately if you're doing a cutover and the first experience in that environment is slow. it's a hard road back to get users to accept that this is a good solution. So I like to club up and then reduce if I need to.
One thing you'll notice with that too is that certain things, so if it's your back-end IT staff and their servers that they're using for maintenance, you can throw those on a little cheaper machines and set the expectation right from the get-go, but definitely when it's anything public-facing to your end users, those solid state or those premium disks make a big difference when it comes to the experience.
Yep, so now if we look at the instance sizes, there's a lot less. So pre-choosing some of those things helps me choose what I'm gonna have. And I'm just gonna do 2 virtual CPUs and 8 gigs of RAM. I can choose how many virtual machines I want a part of the estimate. And then, here's the part where we start talking about pay-as-you-go. In any given month, there's roughly 730 hours in the month. And we can see the cost in the upper right-hand corner there. But if this is the type of virtual machine that I only need to run half the month, make that change, and it changes the cost. So when you're making your estimate, you can kind of go through and play with that and decide how you're going to use it.
This is where knowing your environment's important. If you run domain controllers across a very dispersed environment, you can shut 4 or 5 of them off and save yourself some cost because you only have a few people connecting at night, or application servers, things like that. But as opposed to, say, some sort of web server or something, those are the ones definitely you're going to want to look at other cost optimization strategies as opposed to some of the pay-as-you-go shut-off automation.
So next, we can choose pay-as-you-go, or we can choose some of the savings plans. Of course, after I did my presentation, Microsoft has included a new savings plan, which I know very little about, so I'm not going to talk a ton about it, but the first savings plan is basically committing a dollar amount to your subscription and to save you money. The other one, the reserved instance, is basically saying, I'm going to commit to running this size virtual machine for a year or 3 years. And you can see that there's some pretty significant discounts there. So I think it's a good idea if you're going to consider moving to Azure, keeping it as pay-as-you-go, making sure everything works okay, and then make a consideration like, yes, I've committed to this, and start committing to save money. And same with the operating system. Azure Hybrid Benefit is a benefit of EA agreements, enterprise agreements, or software assurance. If you have those types of licensing, you have a certain amount of Azure Hybrid Benefits. Basically, you go in and you check a box to say, I've already paid for Windows, and they stop charging you per second when the virtual machine runs.
It's nothing worse than double paying Microsoft for licensing just for fun. They don't need the money that bad.
So managed disk, I'll assume this virtual machine needs 1 disk. I have options. If I didn't choose an S, I wouldn't have the SSD options. So I'm going to choose a premium SSD. I'm going to do 128 gigs. And if you notice, there are fixed sizes here. You're not going to choose like a 302 gig disk. You're going to do a 256, or you're going to do a 512. 120 gig disk, and I want 1 of them. So it just kind of sits and builds this up. When we have VPN gateway, we want it to be in the same region. And choosing a region helps a little bit because some resources aren't available in all regions, and sometimes the pricing in the region varies a little bit. In our scale, it's pennies on the month. If you're a Fortune 500 company and you're going to run 1,000 virtual machines, it probably matters a little bit. So North Central US, it's VPN gateway. I like to standardize on the VPN gateway 1 because it allows us to do IKE v2. It's more throughput options. And we're going to run it all month because we want our tunnels to stay up all month. Here's if we're going to do site-to-site tunnels, it includes 10. So in our example, we don't have to worry about adding any more service, and up to 128 point-to-site tunnels. My 60 users could all connect if I needed to. And it's a VPN. I don't often worry about bandwidth. If you know that you're going to have a lot of bandwidth between you and your data center, you can certainly sort that out. But if I put in 160 gigs of monthly bandwidth, it's $4.80. So it's not particularly expensive. So I don't typically worry about that too much. If you know you have a lot of bandwidth, it is probably something to pay attention to because this will vary every month you have a really busy month, you're going to pay more. So it's a matter of monitoring it and sorting that out. So next, we have backups. Azure Virtual Machine, we're going to have one virtual machine. It's 125 gigs backup. And just by default, the policy is 30 days. We can do weekly, monthlies, yearlies, keep X amount of more snapshots during the day. Choose you can do this individually per virtual machine, or you can kind of just make an estimate if your daily churn, how much data changes on the system, if it's low or high, and that calculates how much storage, tries to estimate how much storage you're going to have. But I always do GRS, global redundant storage. So your virtual machines are going to be in a data center. They're going to be stored on 3 individual storage disks in that particular data center. When you do recovery vault, it's going to be in that data center, also on 3 disks. But when you GRS, it's replicated to a paired data center geographically 100 miles away, also on 3 disks. So you can do LRS and it saves you some money, but if a meteor hits northern Ohio, you're kind of toast. So, and now that that's all in there, in this quick example, it's the estimate. It's always an estimate. Don't call it a quote, because it will always fluctuate. It's around $317. I can save it. I can export it into a spreadsheet, share it, things like that. But I have already done. That didn't take too long, but for this whole estimate for all the different virtual machines, let's look at it if we're going to do compute for 3 years.
And one thing to note here is that this looks a little overwhelming and a little confusing, especially if you're just looking at getting into the Azure platform. Finding yourself some talent in-house that you can either hire, working with a partner, working with Microsoft, all those are great strategies. Even talking to your peer group on getting some advice on design is huge, because you can quickly spend a lot of money if you're making some mistakes that someone more experienced could kind of pick out right away. So try to lean on your partner group or your peer group to help you navigate these as you become more accustomed to Azure.
Yep. So here's our estimate, all dolled out. It's a lot more than, I wish they would simplify this, but here's what we got. We can see all the different virtual machines that were listed there. When we do, if there's a data disk in a system, we have to add an additional disk. So that's, what this is listed here. Did everything as premium SSD. You got the virtual network gateway, the backup. So you basically just complete the exercise. For this example, if you're doing it in your own environment, just kind of complete it all out, fill it all out, and then you get your estimate at the end here. So now, let's switch back to the slides.
So knowing what this ends up costing, or you can see on the monthly cost, and a lot of you are probably familiar with understanding infrastructure costs. What do you think is going to be the more expensive approach? Any idea? Azure or on-prem? No idea? Anyone? Let's see.
So, survey says, we'll go with the hardware first. Just the hardware on this, 2 new VMware hosts, and direct connect to a shared storage device, the Microsoft licensing, VMware software and subscription to keep that going in the environment, 3 years of maintenance, and to try to make it a total cost of ownership type of scenario. I included maintenance, 8 hours a quarter to do firmware on the array, the hosts, VMware platform upgrades, maintenance, maybe more, maybe less. If you can do those types of things yourself, obviously you save money. If you're using a service provider like Network Center, there's a cost to it. Please do your updates. It's important. But it doesn't also, to not overcomplicate it, I didn't include any maintenance for Veeam running or the DR site and replicating off there. That total cost, the way it came out, and these were actually costs that I put together for the customer, is about $100,000. Now, on Azure, doing the Azure monthly cost with a 3-year commit for compute, $3,200, calculating that out, I can do that math, it's pretty simple. 36 times that is $116,000, which is more expensive. It includes backups for 30 days. It follows the 3-2-1 rule, so 3 copies of your data on 2 different storage devices, one of which is offsite. Really important. The VPN gateway, and then pay-as-you-go Windows licensing and CALs. So remember, if the kombucha girl meme, maybe yes. If we change the change how we're going to pay for Windows licensing, if you commit to the Microsoft licensing for the same 3-year term, that reduces the Microsoft costs. And now that cost is dipped below the hardware costs. So these are, I'm not an accountant, full disclaimer. I don't know if this fully qualifies as a great TCO example. There's probably CFOs out there going, you didn't consider all this, and I'm really happy to talk to somebody about what I've missed, because I want to make sure that these types of decisions, all the information's out there and somebody makes the right decision. I don't want anybody to come back after 6 months and go, you sold me an albatross. I don't want to do that. So I thought this was a really interesting case, because at first, like I said, when you look at it and go, well, this cost, and the pay-as-you-go cost was probably like $4,300 a month, which is like well overshot the hardware cost. You look at the hardware, if you look at the Azure costs, they're very different. But as soon as you start balancing the things out and you're considering some of the different things, because the Azure platform updates itself, you don't have to worry about those types of things. So it's definitely something to consider when you consider the discounts you can get, to not be as afraid about the sticker shock number.
And this, again, back to mentioning just having someone experienced doing this, is one simple change there on licensing that you might not have thought of or realized is going to grab you an extra $26,000 over a 3-year period. So while not huge when it comes to the rest of probably your IT budget, it's something that definitely makes a big difference. And as you start to understand your workloads better, you can even get more efficiencies out of there than even that. That's just trying to get as close as you can to an apples-to-apples comparison.
So, how can we save money? Mentioned it a couple of times. Reserved instances is the older way to save money. Basically, I'm committing to using a virtual machine size for 1 to 3 years. Now that there's the new Azure Savings Plan, which came out in October. I don't know a ton about it yet, but that's a different way of doing that. So I think that's the way Microsoft wants to do it going forward. So definitely take a look at that. If you can, if it's a machine that you don't use often, figure out how to turn it off when you don't need it. If nobody works on the weekend on that system, turn it off. Now you can't combine pay-as-you-go, and it doesn't do any good to combine shutting off and turning it on with a commit resource, because there's no additional discounts. You've already paid the fee for that. But it's definitely, and you can use the Azure calculator to say, here's that server, here's how much money I can spend on it if I do a commit for a year and keep it on all the time, or if I know I'm only going to use it X amount per month, I can do that calculation and figure out which one's cheaper and do whichever one works for you. And then if you start with the pay-as-you-go, turning it off and on, and you decide not to do that, then you switch over to the 1-year commit or the 3-year commit. Switch to SaaS applications as you can. Everything is going that way. 365 is. You can run your SQL instances as managed. When your SQL databases as managed instances in SQL, there's cost savings there. If you have a Salesforce, you can use QuickBooks Online. Nobody I know likes QuickBooks Online, so I understand if you don't. But all those types of services are out there, and some of these organizations are going to push you that way anyway. So keep that in mind when you're forecasting. Okay, what's this going to look like in 3 years? Try to get a good idea of what you run in your business, if you're even going to be able to run it on site. And then like Azure Files, there's a ton of other Azure services out there. We've all been told for 8 years to turn our file servers into SharePoint servers. I don't know anybody's really done that yet, but it's getting there. Like the hype machine starts, but Azure Files is a way to map a drive to an Azure storage account and get your Windows people, Windows users access to it. If you don't need a full 2 virtual CPU virtual machine to run that, then you can save money on that, because that's a less expensive resource. So now we're going to have Ryan kind of explain where he came from and get some insight from him about because his environment was heavily in Azure. I'm going to quiz him. We're going to see what kind of answers he comes up with.
Knew there was going to be a test today. So I can set the stage for you. So I was at an engineering company, a large engineering company for the region, mostly up in the upper Midwest. We had about 24 locations. We were on a lot of aging hardware. We had taken out a technical debt, if you will, and tried to extend the life out of some equipment to the point where I wasn't comfortable supporting what we had existing. So we had options that we were looking at, a large capital spend to support a substantial amount of storage. We're talking in the hundreds and hundreds of terabytes of storage, lots of compute resources, and older networking equipment. So there was going to be a huge upgrade and kind of transformation that we were looking at. A lot of users that needed to connect to this stuff. We were very early in the stages of people starting to work more remote and have a more dynamic work environment. So that was what we were looking at. The other things that I didn't know starting there was what the company trajectory looked like. Were we growing or were we shrinking? How was this going to change? And it wasn't a question that could be easily answered either. There was a lot of disruption in the economy and things were changing. So we didn't know what we'd do there. As a result, there's also a low desire for capital spend. Do we want to invest $500,000, $600,000 to replace some of our infrastructure, even just to get us up to more of a baseline? Or was there ways that we could mitigate that spend up front while we figured out where the company was going?
So why did you choose Azure? Like, what made you choose it?
Yeah, I guess the big thing is just the unknown. So I don't want to go all in on a solution only to realize that I made a huge mistake, overspent, designed something that was either overkill for the company or even worse, realize I have to go back to the CFO and say, hey, I screwed up here. I need another $100,000 because we didn't plan for the growth that we were expecting. We missed something key there that is going to change a lot of our environment. So just having that dynamic ability to expand, grow, or shrink, at least until I could get some more insight on the company trajectory, was huge.
So you're a technical person. At some point in time, you have to sit in a room and talk to your CFO and your CEO who probably don't know as much about technology. How did you justify the decision to go into something? Because at some point in time, it's easy to say, I know hardware, I want to keep my servers. How did you justify making the leap?
Yeah, good question. So one of the big things that I looked at was that expected cost. So I knew that while there would be a steady growth rate as we moved further and further into Azure, I could calculate that on a month-to-month basis and give that to our CFO, who then could say, hey, I like these expected costs. You know, this is the OpEx versus CapEx conversation I'm sure every one of you is having. At that point, it was basically saying, well, you better do this. I don't care about the technical piece of it because we can actually plan this out and we have a good insight on what that trajectory looks like.
So when you moved, the decision was made, and what workloads did you move to Azure? Were you able to move everything? Did you have any issues?
Yeah, so a couple of things. I was very new to the Azure world, so some of the first things I did was I leaned on a partner who knew a lot more than I did about Azure. And the second piece is I don't really like to dive in head first. You know, I want to dip my toes in the water, if you will. So started moving low impact workloads right away. Looked at moving a domain controller, adding a couple of low risk application servers that were only used occasionally just to see how it worked, start to build out the environment, and hopefully if and when I inevitably made a mistake there, it wasn't quite as big of a financial impact. Once we got comfortable there, we immediately started moving our high priority workloads. The things that were our hardware to crash right away, we're still up and running because we've already put those on way more reliable infrastructure. I can tell you unequivocally that Microsoft spends a little bit more on their back-end infrastructure than I was willing to do. So that was where we went and started, and then it was just going down the list of what can we move and how soon can we move it and what is our bandwidth in-house for our personnel.
So now that you moved, did you have any workloads that didn't work? Did you have anything that you tried to move that failed, or you find that you couldn't get support?
Yeah, so there were certain things that we ran into. application servers that also required maybe like a SQL dependency, and it wouldn't make sense to move one or the other. You had to move them in tandem. And then you get in the chicken the egg scenario of which one do you move first, and how do you experience that. How we eventually addressed that was a managed SQL instance. Then we could run our environment the way it sat. We could move workloads over, do a hard cut one night, and then have an already replicated application server in Azure that we could just flip over and then point to the new database. Sounds easier than I make it sound there. It was a lot of work, but we were able to get those ones. The other ones are anyone that works in manufacturing or in, they have more unique software. There's things called hasp keys, so they're USB devices that you plug into your hypervisor that then assigns a license, usually based on like the MAC address of the device or something like that, that are legacy, and they suck, I guess is the nicest way to put it. So anyone that's had hasp keys knows the headache that they cause all the time. One of them fails, the USB drive goes out, whatever, and all of a sudden, hey, you got 200 users that can't work because their license isn't getting assigned anymore. So trying to get those to move right away was a big pain. No idea what to do there. Eventually, again, reached out to somebody that's ran into something like that before, and we found a way to virtualize those USB devices even and send those up to Azure, which would solve a lot of our licensing bottlenecks that we ran into.
So throughout the whole process, you convinced your organization to move to it, you moved everything. What did you learn about the process? Not necessarily about the technology, but just overall in moving your infrastructure?
Yeah, I think one of the big things is again, probably a lot of you have ran into it, is no one expected a pandemic to come through and completely paradigm shift what our work structure looked like, where people were working, different new security threats and things that we had to face at that point. For us, it was the amount of workloads and the dispersity geographically of our user base and how we dealt with that. So we were heavily located in North Dakota, but we had users all across the entire United States. So that shift to Azure and the unexpected growth that we needed to have on our compute resources there was it was very beneficial that we had already made that decision to move to Azure. I won't say that it was good planning on my part since I hadn't realized that was coming, but it helped us a ton stay nimble and stay capable as we moved 90% of our workforce to working from home for several years.
So considering all this type, all the migration, everything, what would current Ryan do if you could go in a time machine and go back and talk to old Ryan? What advice would you give yourself?
I think the big thing is I was nervous right away, right? So I moved slow. I bought pay-as-you-go, not knowing if I wanted to keep that there, and I extended that pay-as-you-go out longer than I should have. So once I was comfortable where I was sitting, confirmed that it was working correctly and that the experience was good, at that point I should have made the decision to move to an RI right away, or to start automation to turn these devices off. And that was the big thing is, you know, I was waffling back and forth. Do I do pay-as-you-go and set up automation? I didn't know how to do it well. Start small, right? Do an RI, and then as you want to get more comfortable in some of that run books and automation, then move those devices. But I would have realized a lot more cost savings had I been quicker to jump in on some of those pieces.
So basically, today we've talked about, you know, how you could make your own Azure estimate if you want to play around with your what an estimate looks like for your environment, how to collect some information. I like to use RV tools for that. Use that as input into the Azure calculator. Talked about things that affect cost, oversized virtual machines, your software licensing, your cost model if you're going to do pay-as-you-go or you're going to commit to 1 or 3 years. How to save money. Use the savings options available. More than likely, if you're going to move to Azure, it's not going to be for a month or two, and then you're going to move back on-prem. Hopefully not. So if you're going to be up there, you're likely going to be up there for a while. Commit at least to a year and take those discounts. And then we talked about the scenario, input from a customer data, and then we kind of went through a cost analysis of that, and then we got some insight from Ryan, who's somebody who's actually gone through this. I thought it was important to have somebody like Ryan in here because I stand up here all the time and say, this is great, you should buy it. I think it's really cool. But I'm also not the one who has to cut the check or talk to your CFO or talk to your CEO about why this is a great idea. I can show them all the demonstrations, but you're the one who has to pay, you know, use your collateral, your clout to get that going and why it's a good decision for your business. So I appreciate Ryan showing up and helping with that. Thank you for staying long. We talk a lot. This is us shortening it down. Here's our contact information, emails, LinkedIn, Twitter, if that's still going to exist in 3 or 4 months, who knows. But I know everybody has to go somewhere else, but if anybody has any questions, we're here until somebody kicks us out in 10 minutes.
Yeah, and thanks everyone for coming. A couple of parting things that I just want everyone to know is that, like I mentioned before, use your resources available to you, whether it's, if you have enough spend, Microsoft has really good programs in place to give you advice, give you architects that can help you design out your system. Network Center is a great resource. I've used them a ton over the years. They saved me way more money than I ever wrote them checks for by making sure I didn't make the mistakes I was trying to make. And then your partner group is huge too, right? So I leverage my partner group and my relationships that I've built over the years. Lean on those people that you know that have already made this journey and have moved there so they can help give you advice and help you steer clear of some of the mistakes that maybe they made. So, does anybody have any questions? Yeah.
Do you have any experience doing this, or either of you, with the federal Azure or government having to deal with data sovereignty and where it is located?
Not yet, just because the cities and counties that we work with haven't made that move yet. I know there are different data centers for that, but it's not something I've had to deal with yet. But just starting out with don't start things in the public data centers is probably a really good idea, because you're going to have to pull it out or probably write some reports and get in trouble for putting stuff there. But certain things do have to go in the government data centers.
I know the environments are very similar. So if you get comfortable working in this scenario on stuff that maybe doesn't have to be in that government sector, it's not a hard transformation to learn that environment either. It's just a little bit more security, compliance requirements, things like that. Yep.
So you talked about moving workloads and stuff up there. Did you move any users up there into the virtual environment, and how was their experience?
Yeah, great question. So originally when we started moving remote we leveraged a company called WorkSpot. They were great for giving you the easy button. They cost a little bit more than what a traditional VDI environment would be, but all you'd say is I need 30 users or 50 users or 500 users, and they'll create all of the stuff for you and just say, here, give me your login, and it's done, right? Once we got comfortable in that scenario, then we moved to what was called WVD at the time, which is Windows Virtual Desktop, then transformed to AVD, and holistically called VDI, right? Let's keep going with the alphabet here while we're at it, but there was a learning curve for sure, and Microsoft matured, and we learned a lot about optimizing those workloads. Depending on what users were trying to do, a lot of times it was application changes. So if you're trying to save money, virtualized GPUs are super expensive. You can move to just CPU-based compute and change the application to rely on CPU only versus GPU, things like that we didn't know right away. As we grew and matured, we learned some of that stuff. But yeah, eventually we ended up moving quite a few workloads to AVD, hundreds of our users there. And I won't say that the experience is amazing. I also won't say that it's bad, right? It's just a different transformation. You just have to set appropriate expectations. And we did a lot of UAT training and testing and making sure that we worked with all of our user base to understand what the differences were and why there was benefit there and what was different from what their maybe high-end computing machine in their desk was. Good question. Anyone else? Brady, we're counting on you. Awesome. Yep.
Yes.
So I've worked more with like AWS for cloud stuff. What's the difference, I guess, with AWS and Azure? How would you compare them?
At the end of the day, it's virtual machines and services. Some of it is a Ford Chevy argument, in my opinion. If any of the developers are around, they're going to say they want AWS versus Azure because Microsoft's not cool and Amazon is cool. To me, some of it's a cost model, some of it's what you're familiar with and who you want to get support from. You could definitely do a lot of these things in AWS. The cost model is different, but I think you'll still get the same type of cost savings from an environment. It's pretty different, so I can't take this immediately and turn that into an AWS quote, but the theory is the same. AWS has some different ways to save money, like you prepay X amount and you put your resources in a bucket kind of thing, but they're very similar.
For me, the big thing that made our decision was, like you said, Chevy versus Ford, right? I was already comfortable in the 365 environment. I understood their portal, their interface, how they map things. It was intuitive to me. And Azure was an easy shift to go over there. So we wanted the quickest, easiest way to get there because of all of the changes we needed to make kind of lightning fast. And Azure was the easier route to go from that standpoint on a learning curve. So, but the path of least resistance is what made our decision. Yeah.
We'll both be around. I have another session this afternoon. So feel free to hit me up and ask me any more questions. Go get some coffee. Get to your next session. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.